The winter of 1887 did not arrive in Wyoming so much as it attacked it. Snow came sideways, driven by a wind that screamed across the open plains like a living thing. Telegraph wires hummed. Barn doors rattled in their hinges. Somewhere out on the range, cattle bawled in terror as the blizzard swallowed the horizon and turned sky and earth into one white, shifting void. At the edge of Cheyenne, the little train station crouched against the storm, its windows filmed with frost, its lanterns burning low and stubborn in the dark. The last train east had rolled away 3 hours ago, its plume of smoke torn apart by the wind long before it reached the curve in the tracks. On a hard wooden bench inside, a woman sat alone, wrapped in a thin gray shawl that did nothing against the cold. Elizabeth Libby Montgomery exhaled, and her breath rolled out in fragile white clouds that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. Her cheeks were raw from the wind. Her fingers, curled around a small leather bag, had passed beyond pain into that heavy, frightening numbness that whispered of frostbite. Inside the bag lay everything she owned that the world would recognize as worth anything. 3 crumpled dollars. A worn photograph of her parents, taken before illness hollowed them out and took them one after the other. A sheaf of certificates bearing the elegant script of Philadelphia's finest charity hospital, proving that she had studied, worked, bled, sweated, and earned the right to call herself a nurse. And somewhere underneath those papers, squeezed between a spool of thread and a tiny glass vial of laudanum, there was the thing no one could see and no one wanted to pay for. Her stubborn, bruised, ridiculous heart, full of dreams that had turned to ice. The station master had banked the stove hours ago and retreated to his office to sleep. The iron belly of the thing still glowed faintly, but the heat never reached the benches. A damp draft slid under the doors and crept through every crack and nail hole. Libby pulled her shawl tighter and tucked her feet up onto the bench, trying to trap what little warmth remained in her skirts. If the storm didn't ease by morning, the next train east might not come at all. If it didn't come, she had nowhere to go. And if she stayed here through another night with nothing but a dead stove, she might not live to see another sunrise. She tried to rub feeling back into her fingers. They were chalk-white at the knuckles, red and raw at the tips where she dropped a bottle of carbolic acid 2 towns back and sliced her palm trying to catch it. She flexed her hand out of habit, testing the healing wound. It stung, but held. "I've worked through worse," she whispered to herself, voice shaking from the cold. "You delivered bobbies through August heat and February sleet. You held men's hands while they bled out. You stitched faces and legs and futures back together. You don't fall apart on a train bench." But it was one thing to be brave in a hospital ward, surrounded by white enameled beds and the steady clink of instruments. It was another to be brave when the whole world was a howling darkness, when you had $3 to your name and no one waiting for you on either end of the tracks. She closed her eyes. The memories came again, uninvited. The charity hospital in Philadelphia, its tall brick walls, its echoing corridors that always smelled of carbolic and boiled linens. The long winter nights spent moving from bed to bed, checking pulses, adjusting bandages, murmuring comfort to patients who feared dying alone. And then the night everything ended. Dr. Harrison's breath had smelled of whiskey and arrogance. He'd cornered her in the supply room, his hand clamping over the shelf behind her, his body blocking the door. "Come now, Miss Montgomery," he'd purred, eyes glittering. "Don't be ungrateful. You owe me some gratitude for your training, do you not?" She said no, once, twice, a third time with all the force she had. His fingers had dug into her arm. The bedpan had been there, cold and solid on the shelf at her elbow. The crack of metal against cartilage, his roar of pain, the sudden gush of blood from his broken nose. In the end, none of it had mattered. His word carried weight, hers did not. Unseemly conduct, the board had called it, all of them staring down their long, righteous noses at her. Inappropriate behavior with a superior, disruptive influence in the wards. She stood there with her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles ached, and she'd watched as her future was taken apart with a fountain pen and a few elegant phrases. No hospital in Philadelphia would hire her after that. News traveled fast, news twisted faster. So she'd gone west, first to St. Louis, where she worked in a back alley clinic that paid in coins and leftover bread. Then farther, following rumors and newspaper notices like crumbs on a trail, mining towns desperate for anyone who knew how to bind a wound or lance an abscess. Each new train carried her farther from everything she'd once recognized as home. And now, in Cheyenne, the last of her money had vanished into a boarding house keeper's pocket, and the woman's eyes had gone cold the moment Libby said she could not pay for another night. "Try the Mission," the landlady had said, shrugging as she swept her out into the snow, "or the train station, but you won't last long in this weather, missy." The wind shrieked outside, pressing against the walls. The station door rattled on its hinges. Libby curled herself tighter, her medical bag pressed against her ribs like a shield. She did not pray for a miracle. She had prayed for justice in Philadelphia and received a dismissal slip. She had prayed her father would wake up from his fever and had watched him slip away instead. Tonight she only prayed for enough strength to keep breathing until morning. The sound reached her through the howl of the storm. Not the moan of the wind or the distant clatter of loose boards, but a sharper, more deliberate rhythm. Hooves on frozen ground. The heavy, measured beat of a horse that knew where it was going even when the rest of the world had forgotten. She lifted her head, squinting at the frost-coated window. Through the swirling white, a shape emerged, a dark silhouette atop an even darker horse. Snow whipped around them, outlining man and animal in ghostly halos. The rider swung down from the saddle with the easy grace of someone who had spent more time on horseback than on solid floors. He patted the stallion's neck, tied the reins to the post, then turned toward the station, shoulders broad beneath a heavy wool coat. When he pushed the door open, the night's fury rushed in with him, needles of snow, a blast of air so cold it slapped the breath from Libby's lungs. He stepped inside and slammed the door shut again. The wind's howl dulled to a muffled roar. For a moment, he stood in the dim lamplight, pushing his hat back and brushing snow from his coat with strong, sure hands. He was taller than any man Libby had ever met, broad-shouldered, built solid as the ranch houses she'd seen from train windows. His coat, though dusted with snow, was finely cut. His boots were polished leather, expensive and well cared for. A dark mustache framed his mouth, and his jaw looked like it had argued often with gravity and always won. But it was his eyes that made Libby's frozen heart give a reluctant, bewildered flutter. They were the color of whiskey held up to the sun, warm, steady, and unexpectedly kind. "Evenin', miss," he said, tipping his hat with gloved fingers. His voice rolled out low and deep, touched with a Texas drawl that gave every word a lazy kind of music. "Mighty cold night to be sittin' here on your own." Libby tried to answer, tried to say I'm fine, or at least I will be, but her teeth were chattering too hard for the words to make sense. What came out was a breathy, broken sound. He frowned, not the impatient frown she'd seen 100 times from doctors and administrators back east, but one full of genuine concern. He took a step closer. His gaze flicked over her thin shawl, her reddened hands, the blue tinge at the edges of her lips. Then it dropped to the leather bag clutched against her. He recognized it for what it was at once. "Are you a doctor?" he asked. Libby managed to shake her head. "Nurse," she forced out. "Elizabeth Montgomery from Philadelphia." The man's eyebrows lifted. A trained nurse was rarer than whiskey, without water in Wyoming Territory. "Name's Jack Thornton," he said, stripping off his gloves. "Most folks call me Jack. I own the Double T Ranch about 20 miles north of here. Snow melted in his hair, leaving dark streaks among the black. Been in town on business. Was headin' home when I saw you sittin' in here lookin' like one more hour might turn you to ice. He glanced toward the stove in the corner, then back to her. Miss Montgomery, you're gonna freeze to death if you stay here, he said simply. Storms pickin' up, tracks might be blocked by mornin', and this place isn't fit to keep a dog warm. Come with me. Let's get you someplace with a real fire. Libby's instinctive answer rose up sharp and fast. No, I can't just go off with a stranger. I don't know you. I've learned what happens when men decide they know what's best for me. But the words stuck in her throat beneath the ice and exhaustion and the heavy weight of reality. He must have seen the hesitation in her eyes because his expression softened. He crouched a little, bringing himself more level with her on the bench, never reaching out to touch her without asking. I know you don't have any reason to trust me, he said quietly, but it's gettin' dangerous cold. I ain't askin' for anything, Miss Montgomery, not a thing. Just let me get you warm and fed. After that, you can decide what you want to do. She swallowed, her tongue felt numb. I have no money for a hotel, she murmured, ashamed of how small her voice sounded. That's not your concern tonight, Jack said, and there was a quiet authority in his tone that reminded her oddly of a good surgeon in an emergency. You can pay me back with stories if it eases your conscience, or you can decide I'm a scoundrel and never see me again after sunrise. But if you stay on this bench, you may not see sunrise at all. The brutal honesty of that landed like a slap. Her fingers slipped on the leather strap of her bag. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and swung it around her shoulders before she could argue. Warmth enveloped her, not just from the thick wool but from his own lingering body heat. She inhaled and caught the faint scents of leather, horses, wood smoke, and a hint of pine soap. The sudden contrast made her eyes sting. Can you stand? He asked. Libby tried. She pushed herself up from the bench, but her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Her knees buckled, and she clutched the edge of the seat to keep from collapsing. Jack's hand appeared, solid and steady, hovering near her elbow but not grabbing. May I? He asked. She nodded, embarrassed and grateful all at once. He slid one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees. In one smooth movement, he lifted her off the bench as if she weighed nothing at all. Her medical bag came up too. He must have hooked the strap with his thumb. Libby's first instinct was to flinch, to brace herself for the unwelcome press of hands or breath. But Jack held her like something precious and breakable, not like something he was entitled to. His grip was firm but careful, his gaze straight ahead as he turned toward the door. The hotel's just across the street, he said. You hang on to that bag, I'll do the rest. The door groaned open again, and the storm slammed into them. Snow stung her face. The wind tried to tear Jack's coat off her shoulders, but his arms tightened, sheltering her against his chest. She could feel the solid rhythm of his heart through the wool. He staggered once as an icy gust shoved at his back, then planted his boots wide and pushed forward. For the first time in months, someone else was fighting the night for her. Cheyenne's main street was a blur of white and shadow. Gas lamps flickered behind veils of snow. Signs creaked and groaned on their chains. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and went silent. Jack's boots crunched through drifts as he carried her across the street and up the steps of a 3-story building, with a wide balcony and brass lamps flanking the doors. The Cattleman's Hotel. Inside, it was another world. Warmth struck Libby's frozen skin with almost painful intensity. Plush carpets muffled their footsteps. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead. Men in suits and women in satin gowns turned in unison, their conversations faltering as they took in the sight of Jack Thornton, one of the territory's wealthiest ranchers, carrying a bedraggled woman in a threadbare shawl. Mr. Thornton, the desk clerk, a narrow-faced man with slicked hair, hurried forward. "Is everything all right, sir?" "Not yet," Jack said. His voice carried through the lobby without needing to be raised. "This lady was at the train station, half frozen. I need your best room. Send up hot food, coffee, and every blanket you can find. If Doc Williams is still in town, have someone fetch him." "Yes, sir, right away." The clerk snatched a key from the board. "Room 12, second floor. I'll have the maid light the fire at once." "I'll carry her up," Jack said. Libby felt eyes following them as he mounted the stairs. She heard the hiss of whispers. Who is she? Where did he find her? But the warmth soaking into her bones mattered more than any rumor. The room he carried her into was bigger than her entire boarding house back in Philadelphia. A large bed with a carved headboard, heavy curtains drawn against the storm, a marble fireplace already crackling to life. Jack set her gently on a chair near the hearth, then went immediately to poke the fire, feeding it more wood until the flames leaped higher. "Your clothes are damp," he said, still facing the fireplace. "We'll have dry ones brought up. You need heat, but not too fast or you'll be in more trouble than you know." He turned and handed her a blanket from the bed, his gaze carefully fixed on her face, never wandering. "Wrap yourself in that." There was a knock at the door. A bellboy entered with a tray of coffee, soup, and bread, followed by a maid dragging an armful of blankets. Jack tipped the boy, then poured coffee into a porcelain cup and brought it to Libby, wrapping her hands around it with his own to steady the trembling. "Small sips," he said. "You'll feel it burning a path through you, but that's good. Means you're still alive." She tried to laugh, but it came out more like a choked breath. "You seem very sure of what to do," she said, voice hoarse. He shrugged, dropping into the chair across from her. The firelight danced over his features, warming the hard lines of his jaw, catching the faint silvering at his temples that told of days in the sun and nights with too much responsibility. "Out here you learn," he said. "If you don't, people die. Men fall off horses, get thrown into fences, catch pneumonia from one long day in the wrong kind of rain. The Double T is 20 miles from the nearest town. I know enough to stop the worst of the bleeding and keep fever from taking a man in the first hour. After that," he spread his hands, "we pray and hope." "And you still say you're no doctor," she murmured, sipping the coffee. Warmth slid down her throat into her chest, blooming outward like a small, stubborn sun. "No, ma'am." He shook his head. "I'm a rancher who's seen too many decent men go under because we don't have anyone who truly knows what they're doing. Which is why when I heard a trained nurse was coming through town, I asked some questions." He hesitated. "Hotel clerk said a woman with a doctor's bag and a Philadelphia accent had been asking about work." "So you were looking for me," Libby said slowly. "In a manner of speaking." His lips quirked almost sheepishly. "Didn't expect to find you turning into an icicle." "If you hadn't come," she said quietly, "I might have." He met her gaze, and something fierce and protective flared there. "Not on my watch," he said. The maid cleared her throat, drawing Libby's attention to the clothes draped over her arm, a modest blue wool dress, clean underthings, stockings, and a sturdy pair of boots. "Mrs. Patterson from room 3 said any woman with the courage to ride the trains in a storm deserves better than frozen skirts," the maid said. "She insisted you take these." Libby blinked back sudden, inexplicable tears. "Please thank Mrs. Patterson for me," Jack said. "I'll step outside while Miss Montgomery changes." He turned to go. "Mr. Thornton," Libby's voice stopped him at the door. He glanced back, hand on the knob. "Yes, ma'am." "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't know me. For all you know, I could be anyone, a liar, a thief, a troublemaker." He studied her for a long moment. The fire cracked softly between them. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be alone," he said finally. "And maybe because I've been praying for someone like you longer than I care to admit." "Someone like me." "A healer," he said. "Someone who can keep my men alive when the work turns ugly. Someone who doesn't fold when the world goes mean. A woman who'd rather swing a bedpan than let a man own her body. His mouth twitched with a hint of a smile. Word travels, Miss Montgomery, even out here. Heat rushed to her cheeks, different from the fire's warmth. I just defended myself, she said. Damn right you did. The brief flash of anger in his eyes wasn't aimed at her. Good. Means you've got more than needles in that bag. Means you've got spine. With that, he gave her a small nod and stepped outside, closing the door. Libby sat for a moment, listening to the muted sounds of the hotel, the clink of glassware, the distant piano in the parlor, the murmur of voices in the hallway. Then she pushed herself to her feet and began to change into the dry clothes. The blue wool dress fit surprisingly well. The boots were a little big, but with extra stockings they would work. When she caught sight of herself in the mirror, hair loose around her shoulders, color slowly returning to her cheeks, a stranger's fine coat draped over her, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Who are you? She wondered. A disgraced nurse. A foolish dreamer. Or something else entirely, standing on the edge of a story that hadn't yet been written. She tightened the belt of the dress, squared her shoulders, and called softly, Mr. Thornton, you can come in now. Jack opened the door and paused on the threshold as his gaze landed on her. For the briefest moment, the carefully controlled rancher vanished, and she saw simply a man tired, strong, unexpectedly vulnerable, looking at a woman who had appeared out of a blizzard like some stubborn, shivering miracle. You look warmer, he said at last, voice rougher than before. Thanks to you, she replied. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. If you feel up to it, he said, I'd like to talk with you about something, about what you might do next, because I don't aim to take you back to that train station. Libby sat on the edge of the bed, the coffee cup warm in her hands. All right, she said slowly. What did you have in mind, Mr. Thornton? He smiled, and in that smile she caught the first glimmer of the future the blizzard had blown her into. First thing, he said, is you call me Jack. First thing, he said, is you call me Jack. Libby's lips curved before she could stop them. Then you must call me Libby. Miss Montgomery sounds like someone still waiting for a hospital board to tell her what she's worth. Jack's eyes warmed. He dragged the second chair closer to hers and sat, forearms resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped between them. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, carved there by years of squinting into sun and distance. He looked carved out of the land itself, weathered, solid, unmovable. Libby, he tried, as if testing how her name felt on his tongue. All right, here. What I'm hoppin' you'll consider. He tipped his head slightly toward her medical bag on the floor. You came west to find work. I came to town lookin' for someone exactly like you. Seems foolish to ignore Providence when it walks through the door carrying a doctor's bag. She studied him, wary but curious. What exactly does someone like me mean to you, Jack? It means someone who knows how to keep a man alive after a horse rolls on him or a bull hooks him in the ribs, he answered easily. Means someone who can handle a fever without panicking, who knows the difference between a wound that needs stitches and one that needs a miracle. It means someone who doesn't faint at the sight of blood and doesn't think ranch life is a big adventure until the first snow hits and the first man dies. He held her gaze steadily. I'd like to hire you, he said simply, as the nurse at the Double T. Libby's breath caught. She'd expected many things out here, rough mining camps, dirty shanty towns, maybe a back room above a saloon where she could bandage drunk cowboys for coins. A position on a ranch with a real medical room, a salary, a roof of her own. That had not been on the list. You have a medical room on your ranch? She asked slowly. Got the bones of one, he said. We built a small cabin near the main house a few years back, thinking we'd convince a doctor to settle. I ordered supplies from Denver and St. Louis whenever I was in town. But every doctor I talked to wanted city living and polite patients, not cowboys who come in half drunk with ribs sticking out. He shrugged. So now I've got a room full of brand new instruments and bottles with Latin labels I can't pronounce. They're sittin', they're gatherin' dust while my men hope they never need 'em. You'd be the one to put those things to use. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, not because she was cold now, but because the idea flooded her with a different kind of shiver. What would you expect from me? She asked, in detail. Jack took that seriously. He leaned back, thinking for a long moment, then began to tick things off on his fingers. Patch up the men when they tear themselves open on barbed wire or catch a boot in the wrong place. Keep an eye on fevers, broken bones, infections. Help foal mares and calve cows if we've got no one else with a steady enough hand nearby. Maybe ride out with me when someone gets hurt on the far end of the spread. His gaze softened. Teach the men what they can do for each other when you're not around, he added. How to wash their hands before they shove M into a wound. How to keep a bandage clean longer than half an hour. They mean well, but sometimes they're as bright as fence posts. She almost smiled. And in return, she asked. In return, you get a salary, he said. Subtract whatever you want to pay back for the clothes in that hotel room if your conscience insists, but I'll warn you now, you'll be arguing with me long past your first gray hair if you try. You get a cabin of your own beside the medical room. Board and meals, courtesy of Cookie and his wife Martha. Any medicine or supplies you say we need within reason. I don't mind paying for what keeps my men alive. And he paused, his expression turning unexpectedly earnest. You get the freedom to do what you train to do without some pompous fool breathing down your neck. No one had ever phrased it quite that way before. She stared at him, weighed his words, weighed herself. I won't be beholden to you beyond my work, she asked quietly. I've heard enough stories about men who hire desperate women and then expect more than they paid for. Color flared along his cheekbones, a quick, fierce flush of anger not directed at her. Libby, he said, his voice lower now, almost rough. I didn't bring you out of that station to cuff you to my bed. You'd be free to walk away any time you pleased, though I'd be damn sorry to see you go. Your job would never depend on you saying yes to anything you didn't want. The bluntness of it made heat climb her throat, but there was something steadying in his honesty. He didn't dance around ugliness. He faced it head-on, gave it a name, and promised where he stood. And if something personal were to develop between us, she asked before she could stop herself, surprised at her own boldness. His eyes darkened with a flash of something she'd seen there before, quick and carefully leashed. Then, he said slowly, it would happen because you wanted it as much as I did, not because of a pay ledger, not because you're cold, not because you're alone, for its own sake or not at all. The room seemed to shrink, as if the four walls had leaned in to listen. Libby's pulse thudded in her throat. I haven't decided, she said softly, unsure whether she meant his offer or the future beneath it. That's fine, he answered, and there was no impatience in it. You don't have to decide tonight, but the storm's built a wall tween here and the train tracks. You couldn't go east even if you wanted to. You're safe here for now, sleep, think. In the morning, if you'd rather try your luck in some mining town, I'll help you get there. But if you've got an ounce of sense, you'll at least come see the double T before you tell it no. He rose and set his hat on his head. Mrs. Patterson's clothes look well on you, he added, almost an afterthought. But I suspect ranch clothes will suit you even better. He left before she could come up with a reply, the door clicking softly behind him. Libby sat alone in the warm room, the fire crackling, the blanket heavy on her shoulders, her medical bag at her feet. The wind outside beat against the window, but in here everything felt strangely still. A job, a cabin, a chance to practice medicine in a place that needed her. And a man whose eyes made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt since before Philadelphia turned its back on her. She lay down on the bed eventually, meaning only to rest for a moment. The pillow smelled of lavender and starch. Sleep took her like a tide. When she woke, sunlight was stabbing in through the curtains, yellow and thin but real. Beneath it, the world had turned from howling darkness to white brilliance. The storm had spent itself. Cheyenne lay under a new coat of snow. A soft knock came at the door. "Libby, you awake?" Jack's voice drifted through the wood. She sat up, fingers rushing to tame her hair. "Yes, just a moment." When she opened the door, he stood there with a tray balanced on one hand, steam rising from covered dishes. He'd shed his heavy coat and wore a fresh shirt, sleeves rolled, a vest buttoned over it. In daylight, she could see the faint scars along his knuckles, the small pale line at his temple where some past injury had kissed bone. "Thought you might be hungry," he said. "Storm's clearin', but the streets are a mess. No reason for you to go downstairs and dodge muddy boots and gossip yet." He set the tray on the table by the window and moved aside so she could sit. The smell of eggs, bacon, and biscuits nearly made her dizzy. "You'll keep spoiling me, and I'll forget how to be properly miserable," she said lightly. "Good," he answered. "Never saw the sense in misery." They ate mostly in silence at first. Libby focused on the food, on the way each bite grounded her back in her body. With every swallow, she felt more like herself and less like a soul drifting between stops. Finally, she set her fork down. "I've been thinking," she said. Jack's chair creaked as he leaned back, giving her his full attention. It was disconcerting, that unwavering focus. No one back east had ever looked at her that way unless she'd done something wrong. And I don't know what awaits me in those camps," she said slowly. "I've heard stories. I've seen some PASS through rail cars. I know how men behave when they're hungry and lonely and think no one will hold them to account." She ran her thumb along the edge of her coffee cup. "Your ranch sounds less uncertain, but it's still a risk. I'd be the only woman there apart from your cook's wife. I'd be relying on you to keep your word." "That you would," he said, "and I would hold myself to it." "I don't like owing anyone," she admitted. "Not after Philadelphia, not after boarding houses and charity wards." He nodded. "I understand, but debt runs both ways. I'm asking you to take care of my men. That's a mighty big thing to ask. We owe each other. That's not the worst arrangement in the world." She took a breath. "I'll try it," she said, "on one condition." His mouth quirked, "Just one." "For now," she said. "If it doesn't work for either of us, I leave with my wages and my dignity. No hard feelings, no locked doors." He extended his hand, the same one that had wrapped around reins and rope and her shivering body. "Deal," he said. She hesitated just long enough to feel the weight of the moment, then clasped his hand. The spark that leapt between them had nothing to do with static or imagination. It was warm, unexpected, and entirely unwelcome to the part of her that still believed the safest path was solitude. A nurse's hands were trained to be steady. This shake was not. Jack's fingers tightened for the barest second before he let go. "I'll have the bill settled and the horses ready within the hour," he said, standing. "Best to reach the double T while the snow's still hard enough to ride on." "An hour," she echoed, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet and resettle in a new position. "All right." By late morning, the town of Cheyenne lay behind them, its small cluster of buildings shrinking against the endless white. Libby sat astride a sturdy bay mare with a gentle eye. Jack had apologized that there was no side saddle on hand. She'd merely swung her leg over the saddle and told him to save his apologies for matters that warranted them. Her skirts were hitched and pinned in a way that would have made half the women back east faint, but out here there was no one to impress and nothing to do but ride. The air was sharp in her lungs, but the sun on the snow made everything brighter. The sky stretched forever, an impossible sheet of blue. In the distance, mountains rose like the backs of sleeping giants, their peaks veiled in lingering storm clouds. They rode side by side for a while in silence, the horses, breath puffing white. "You comfortable?" Jack asked eventually. "I'll be saddle-sore by evening," she admitted. "But it's no worse than 15 rounds up and down the hospital stairs. Then we're startin' at an advantage." He pointed ahead with his gloved hand. "That line of cottonwoods marks the creek that runs along the edge of my land. From there, you'll see the Double T proper." She squinted against the glare. "Do you ever miss the city?" she asked. "The noise, the crowds, the anonymity." He considered it. "Sometimes I miss being able to send a telegram and have a part arrive within a week instead of a month," he said. "Miss a good billiard table now and then, but mostly I miss people I've already lost, not places I've left. Out here," he swept his gaze across the prairie, "out here a man knows where he stands. The land doesn't lie to you. It's hard, but it's honest. I'll take that over a velvet chair and 50 false smiles any day." She thought of Philadelphia, the whispered gossip in hospital corridors, the way colleagues she'd once laughed with had suddenly found urgent reasons to avoid her gaze. "Yes," she said quietly, "I can understand that." The miles passed beneath them. As they neared a gentle rise, Libby caught movement ahead, small figures darting between low buildings, dots of color against the snow. "There she is," Jack said, pride warming his tone. The Double T spread out in the valley below like a small, bustling town. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. A wide, two-story log house sat at the center, flanked by a long bunkhouse, stables, corrals, a blacksmith's forge, and smaller cabins scattered like sturdy children around their mother. Horses moved in the paddocks. Men strode from one job to another, bundled in coats and hats. The place pulsed with life even in the dead of winter. "It's," Libby searched for the right word, "alive." Jack's smile flashed. "Wait till spring, then you'll see her properly dressed." As they rode down into the yard, men began to emerge, wiping hands on trousers, pulling off gloves, curiosity bright in their eyes. It was clear that word had already reached them. The boss was bringing someone home. "Boys," Jack called, reining in his stallion. "This is Elizabeth Montgomery, trained nurse out of Philadelphia. She's agreed to take us on. You treat her with the respect you'd give your own mothers and the reverence you'd give St. Peter if he showed up with a lasso." A ripple of chuckles moved through the group. A grizzled man with gray in his beard stepped forward, tapping his hat. "Tom Bradley, ma'am," he said. "I run the cruise when the boss ain't lookin', and even when he is. We're right glad to have you. Dock in town's too far and too fond of whiskey for my peace of mind." "I'm glad to be here, Mr. Bradley," Libby said, sliding down from her horse with Jack's steadying hand at her elbow. "Though I hope you won't give me too much to do." Tom snorted. "I'd like nothing better than a quiet spring, but these boys find trouble the way a thirsty mule finds water." A younger cowboy, barely out of his teens, grinned around a bandage wrapped messily around his hand. "Got stepped on yesterday tryin' to break in Smudge," he said. "Maybe you can fix what the boss and Cookie did to it." Libby's professional instincts pushed aside nerves. "Let me get settled and I'll take a look," she promised. Jack led her past the main house toward a small, sturdy cabin with smoke curling cheerfully from its chimney. It sat between the big house and another larger structure with wide windows. "This is yours," he said, swinging down and tying his stallion. "And that," he nodded to the other building, "is the medical cabin." She stepped up onto the cabin porch, fingers brushing the railing. The door swung open easily. Inside, the single main room was simple but welcoming. A narrow bed, a small table and 2 chairs, a shelf with a few books and a chipped lamp, a braided rug on the floor. The back doorway revealed a tiny bedroom and a lean-to kitchen with a stove. Everything was clean, everything was hers. Emotion rose sharp in her throat. "There are quilts in the trunk by the bed," Jack said quietly behind her. "Martha insisted, said no one under her watch was gonna freeze at night." I don't know what to say," Libby managed. "Say you'll tell us if you need anything else," he answered. "Come on, let me show you your real kingdom." He guided her to the neighboring building. The moment she opened the door, Libby felt a strange sense of coming home. The air was cold but smelled faintly of carbolic and fresh wood. An examination table stood in the center, sturdy and well-scrubbed. Shelves lined the walls, holding glass bottles, rolled bandages, neatly stacked linens. A wash basin, a small stove for boiling instruments, a tall cabinet with doors fitted with glass. She moved slowly around the room, trailing her fingers over instrument cases, peering at neat labels written in a careful hand. She shook her head. Jack, some of these tools are better than what we had in Philadelphia. I told you, he said. No expense spared for keepin' my men in one piece. Took half a year for some of it to arrive on the train. Glad to see it's finally got a proper captain. Who organized this? She asked, opening a drawer and finding forceps laid out in rows. Martha read the list I sent and said if I was gonna play at buildin' a hospital, I'd damn well do it right. She talked to the doc in town and bullied the suppliers via telegram. She's meaner than any foreman when she wants to be. Libby smiled, already liking this unseen Martha immensely. May I change a few things? She asked, mind already rearranging the space, imagining where she'd want the lamp for late-night stitches, where she'd place the basin so water wouldn't splash onto clean linens. You can tear the walls down if you want, Jack said, long as the roof's still standin' when you're done. As if summoned by talk of water and roofs, a knock sounded at the door. Tom Bradley stuck his head in, the younger cowboy with the bandaged hand hovering behind him. Beggin' your pardon, boss, Tom said, but Billy here been groanin' about his hand all mornin'. Figured if Miss Libby's inclined, she might like a patient to christen the place proper. Libby's response was automatic, bring him in. Billy perched on a stool by the examination table, cheeks pink with embarrassment. Libby fetched scissors, a basin, and fresh cloths, slipping into the calm, focused version of herself that had lived alongside the frightened one for years. She snipped away the filthy bandage. The hand beneath was swollen, the skin angry red, but nothing smelled of rot yet. One toe of the boot he'd been wearing had clearly served as an amateur splint for his fingers, a clever idea, poorly executed. How did this happen? She asked, washing the hand gently, watching his face for flinches. Horse didn't like my face, he muttered, earning a snort from Tom. She was already spooked, Tom corrected. Billy just happened to be between her and the gate. Libby probed carefully. You're lucky, she said. No bones broken, just bruised and crushed. But this, she gestured to the half-healed cut, will get infected if we don't coax it clean. You been lettin' anyone pour whiskey straight on it. Tom looked guilty. Seemed the right thing at the time, miss. It's better than dirt, she allowed. Next time bring him sooner. She irrigated the wound with warm water and carbolic, ignoring Billy's hissed curses. She stitched what needed stitching with quick, deft movements, then wrapped the hand in fresh bandages. Keep it elevated tonight, she instructed. You can muck out stalls with the other hand. No roping or punching for a week. A week, Billy groaned. You can insult people with words instead, she said crisply. If you don't, I'll take the stitches out myself and you can explain to Mr. Thornton why you can't hold a rope come spring. Jack's chuckle rumbled from the doorway. Billy paled. Yes, ma'am, he said. When they left, Jack lingered. You talk like a sergeant when you're in here, he said. I almost feel sorry for them. Almost? She asked dryly. Not quite, he said, then tipped his head toward the door. Martha's expectin' us for supper. She'll tan my hide if I let you eat alone your first night. That evening, Libby caught her first glimpse of what family meant on a ranch. The main house's kitchen was warm and loud. Martha was a broad-shouldered woman with sharp eyes and a heart as soft as her bread. Cookie, whose real name seemed lost to time, ruled the stove with a gruffness that hid clear affection for every soul they fed. They seated Libby at the big table as if she'd always belonged there. Soup, stew, fresh biscuits, and a pie appeared as if by magic. Stories flowed. How Jack had once tried to break in a horse that no one else would ride and ended up in the watering trough. How Tom had chased rustlers across the frozen river one winter. Jack watched her as she laughed, as she asked questions, as she listened. He jumped in only to fill gaps or redirect rowdy comments. It was as if he'd brought home something precious and was now quietly pleased to see it fit. That night when she stepped back into her cabin alone, the quiet wrapped around her like another blanket. She checked the small stove, banked the coals, and sat on the edge of the bed. This was real. She had a job, a place, people who seemed to want her here. Danger still lurked. Winter still howled outside. Men still woke before dawn to risk their bones and lungs. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the world felt less like a battlefield she walked alone and more like a frontier she might actually claim. Days became weeks. Spring came early to Wyoming that year, sneaking in between storms. Snow retreated from the low hills. Thin grass pushed up through the melt. Calves began to drop in the pastures, all knobbly knees and astonished eyes. Libby's world filled with work. She cleaned and bandaged rope burns, set a broken arm after a horse rolled, treated a cook's helper for a kitchen knife gone astray. She vaccinated calves, her small hands quick and sure as she moved through the bawling, shifting mass of animal life. She rode out with Jack twice to check on men working fence lines, the prairie stretching endless around them. The men learned quickly that she would not tolerate unnecessary risk or foolishness. They also learned that she would sit with them through the worst of pain, her voice low and steady, her hands cool and certain. They began calling her Doc, half in jest, half in awe. Evenings developed their own rhythm. Sometimes she joined Martha in the kitchen to chop vegetables and learn the names of all the cowboy's sins and virtues. Sometimes she sat on her cabin porch with a book, the light lingering late in the wide western sky. More and more often, Jack appeared at the edge of the porch as the sun slid down. He'd carry 2 tin mugs, coffee in winter, something cooler as the days lengthened. "Thought the wind might blow you clear to Denver without some weight in your hand," he'd say, passing her a mug. They talked. He told her about growing up in Texas, about a father who'd made a fortune in shipping and a mother who'd insisted he learn to work alongside the hands instead of merely giving orders. He mentioned a brother who had died in the war, his voice going quiet when he did. She told him about Philadelphia, about nights in the charity ward, about the first baby she'd delivered and the first patient she'd lost. She did not talk about Dr. Harrison at first. That story sat in her chest like an unhealed wound. One evening in late April, the sky turned the kind of gold that made the world look as if it had been dipped in honey. Libby sat on her porch steps, boots dusty, skirts hitched, watching the hands drive cattle into a nearer pasture. Jack joined her, lowering himself onto the step with a small, tired sigh. He held 2 mugs, handed her one, and stared out at the land that had become both burden and anchor. "Libby," he said after a while, "there's something I should tell you about my past." She turned to him, heartbeat ticking up. "All right." "I was married before," he said, "back in Texas. Rebecca was her name." Jealousy pricked, sudden and unreasonable. She tamped it down. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Fever," he said simply. "She caught it after a bad winter, went fast. There was nothing the doc could do." He stared into his cup for a long moment. "She was a good woman," he went on. "Gentle, knew all the Psalms by heart. Loved flowers and books more than dust and cattle. She tried to make Texas home in the way she understood, bless her. But she never would have lasted out here, even if she'd lived. The land's too harsh. Takes a different kind of woman to love it." He looked at Libby then, and the weight of that look landed like a declaration all its own. "I've been thinking," he said, "since that night in the bunkhouse when you stitched Billy up like you were mending the Almighty's own coat. Since you rode out with me to tend to Tom's broken arm and never flinched at the snow or the distance. Since I've watched you fit yourself into this life like you were made for it. I've been thinking, he repeated, that maybe the Lord answered two prayers at once when he blew you into that station. Her throat tightened. Jack, she began, but he pressed on. I know you work for me, he said. I know that muddies the water. I don't want you to feel trapped or obliged. But I also can't pretend what I feel for you is just gratitude for patching my men up. Libby, I've fallen in love with you. The world tipped. The sounds of cattle, of distant laughter, of a harmonica from the bunkhouse faded until his voice and her heartbeat were the only things left. She had known, of course. In the way his eyes found hers at supper. In the way he held back from touching her, unless there was a reason. In the way his shoulders relaxed when she walked into a room. She had tried not to name it. Now the name sat in the open between them, solid and terrifying. Jack, she said again more steadily, I care for you too more than is wise. She let out a shaky breath. But care doesn't erase the past, mine or yours. I lost everything I knew once in one afternoon. I had to choose between my pride and my survival. I don't know how to trust that someone won't take what I build and tear it down again. He nodded, accepting that. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, he said, but I can promise I'll never ask you to trade your dignity for my comfort. I watched my mother stand up to men twice her size and 10 times her power. I know what it looks like when a woman bends until she breaks. I'd rather spend my life earning your respect than demanding your obedience. Silence stretched. Then Tom's voice shattered it. Boss, he shouted from somewhere near the corrals. Lightning spooked the remuda. Danny's down. Jack was on his feet in a heartbeat, mug forgotten, eyes sharp. Stay here, he said instinctively. Libby was already moving, snatching her bag from just inside the cabin door. Not a chance, she said. If a man's down, you need me more than you need an extra set of hands on a horse. They ran together toward the commotion. Clouds had rolled in thick and fast while they talked. Thunder growled overhead. The scent of ozone hung heavy in the air. In the near pasture, a cluster of horses milled, snorting and tossing their heads. Men shouted, shifting around something on the ground. When Libby and Jack pushed through the circle, she saw Danny, barely 18, all lanky limbs and restless energy, lying on his back in the trampled mud. His shirt was torn open. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. One side of his ribs was already turning a mottled purple. Horse bolted when the lightning hit the fence, Tom panted. He tried to grab the reins, got knocked flat, and 3 more ran over him before we could get him away. Libby dropped to her knees, fingers finding Danny's pulse, assessing the harsh wheeze of his breathing. Internal bleeding, broken ribs, maybe a punctured lung. She glanced up at Jack. He'll die before the doctor gets here, she said bluntly. I need to open him up, now. A murmur rippled through the men. Jack's jaw tightened. What do you need? 4 men with steady hands, she barked. Lanterns, hot water, clean sheets. Get him to the medical cabin, carefully. If you jostle him, you may kill him yourselves. Jack didn't question her. He snapped out orders. Men moved. The next hours blurred into a tunnel of light and blood and focus. They laid Danny on the examination table, stripped his shirt, cut away leather and cloth. Libby scrubbed her hands until the skin burned, boiled her instruments, and prayed the carbolic would do enough. Tom stood at her elbow, obeying without argument as she instructed him how to sponge away blood, how to clamp where she indicated. Jack hovered out of the way but close enough that she could feel his presence like another heartbeat in the room. She cut through flesh and muscle, working swiftly, every movement an echo of procedures she'd only been allowed to watch in Philadelphia. There, she'd stood behind men in white coats, absorbing everything, knowing she'd never be permitted to take the scalpel herself. Here, no one told her to step aside. The only thing between Danny and the grave was her hands. She found the source of the worst bleeding, a torn vessel between shattered ribs, and tied it off. She repaired what she could, whispered quiet apologies to what she couldn't. She worked until sweat dripped down her spine and her arms shook from tension. Finally, she stitched him closed layer by layer, bandaged his chest, and stepped back on legs that felt like water. For a long moment, the room was silent except for Danny's breathing. It was still shallow, but it was steady. "He's alive," she said, voice hoarse, "and he's got a real chance of staying that way if we keep him still and clean." The men exhaled like a single creature. Tom wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "Doc Williams is gonna have a fit when he sees this," he muttered. "A good fit, I mean, if there is such a thing." Jack moved to Libby's side, catching her elbow as her knees threatened to give out. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though the room spun a little. "I will be, once I sit." He eased her onto the chair against the wall, then turned to the others. "You heard the lady," he said. "He lives, but he's not out of the woods." His voice sharpened. "You'll do exactly what she says regarding his care. Any man who ignores her instructions will answer to me and will like that conversation even less than surgery without whiskey." A few faint laughs broke the tension. Doc Williams, summoned from town, arrived an hour later, red-faced and indignant at having been dragged 20 miles for another fool cowboy injury. His irritation vanished the moment he saw Danny's bandaged chest and the precise stitches beneath. "You did this?" he asked Libby, incredulous. "Yes," she said, too tired to hedge. He whistled softly. "I've seen surgeons in Denver who couldn't have done as clean a job. If he was going to be cut open, better it was by your hand than mine, ma'am." Coming from him, that was no small praise. That night, after Danny had been settled in a smaller cabin where Libby could check on him easily, after the men had drifted back to their duties, Jack walked Libby back to her porch. She moved slowly, every muscle aching. "I know better than to talk to you about any serious decisions when you're this tired," he said, a half-smile tugging at his mouth. "But I'm not patient enough to wait days either." She sank onto the porch step, the wood rough beneath her skirt. "A surgeon taught me most of what I did today," she said quietly. "Back east, through a curtain practically. He never would have let me touch a scalpel under his watch." "He would have today," Jack said, "if he'd seen what I saw." The twilight wrapped around them. Somewhere a coyote called. "Earlier," he went on, "you said you weren't sure you knew how to trust again, that you'd lost everything once and didn't want to put your heart in someone else's hands." He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I can't promise I won't ever disappoint you, but I can promise this. Today, I watched you cut a boy open and put him back together without flinching. I watched 30 hard men look to you like you were the only thing standing between them and helplessness. And I fell in love with you all over again." Her breath hitched. "Jack, I don't want to be just your employer," he said. "I don't want to spend the next 20 years finding excuses to knock on your door under cover of medical consults. I want to build a life with you. I want your stubborn, brilliant mind in mine when I make decisions about this ranch. I want your laughter in my house, every day, for as long as we both have breath." He drew in a shaky breath of his own. "Libby Montgomery," he said, "will you marry me?" She closed her eyes for a long moment. In the darkness behind her lids she saw Philadelphia, cold stone steps, a hospital door closing in her face. She saw the train station bench, the snow, the way her fingers had gone numb. Then she saw Danny's chest rising. She saw the way the men had looked at her, not as a scandal but as a savior. She saw Jack's hand reaching for hers in the firelight weeks ago, his eyes full of promise. When she opened her eyes, the sky overhead was a deep indigo bowl full of stars, and Jack was still there, fists clenched at his sides, every muscle taut with waiting. "Yes," she said. The word came out steadier than she felt. "Yes, Jack Thornton, I will marry you." Relief crashed through his expression, followed by joy so bright it startled her. He stepped forward, cupped her face with hands that had gentled horses and thrown punches, and carried her out of a blizzard. "May I?" he asked one last time. She nodded. His kiss was not the seizing, taking thing she had once feared. It was warm and reverent and a little unsure around the edges, as if he was memorizing her as carefully as a map. Her hands came up of their own accord, fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, feeling the steady beat beneath. When they parted, both were breathing harder. "Tomorrow," he murmured against her forehead, "we'll tell the men and Martha. She'll already have a cake planned, you watch." Libby laughed, giddy and shaken. "What will they say?" she asked. "They'll say it's about damn time," he replied. As the moon climbed higher over the double T, Libby sat with her back against Jack's shoulder, his arm around her, the future stretching out before them like the open prairie. There would be gossip, there would be storms, there would be the relentless, grinding demands of cattle and land and men's tempers. But there would also be this, shared warmth on a cold step, trust built not on whispers in dark corridors, but on work, on courage, on a love that had grown in the honest light of the Wyoming sky. The blizzard that had almost killed her had blown her here for a reason. Now at last she knew what it was. "When you're ready, I'll give you part 3, taking them through the wedding, the fight with the doctor from her past, their later years, and how their love becomes legend."